I suppose you could say we're bracing ourselves, right? Next Sunday is the entryway to Holy Week, a painfully visceral reminder of the last days of Jesus' earthly ministry. The loud celebration of Palm Sunday slips quickly and quietly into the intimacy of a final meal shared among friends, the betrayal of a comrade, the arrest, the beatings, the humiliation, the interrogation, and finally the cruelty and finality of being nailed wrists and feet to a roughly hewn cross of wood. Death is on the horizon. So I suppose we're bracing ourselves today. But we have a safety net, right? Because we live in a time more than 2 millennia since the events we call Holy Week. We know, spoiler alert, that death was not the final chapter. We know it was a jarring chord which made its way through a cadence to a resolution. We know that the tomb will be found empty and Jesus will be raised from the dead on Easter Sunday. Hallelujah. And yet, nevertheless, we must make the journey each year through the devastating events of Holy Week. I wonder if that is because life itself feels more like Holy Week most days. Bittersweetness, betrayal, intimacy, pain, humiliation, the relentless looming shadow of death. Maybe that's what it means to be human. Who's to say? Maybe we're always just bracing ourselves. This morning's texts both stand firmly on their own 2 feet and have certainly, independent of one another, sparked innumerable reflections and sermons. But rather than going into the details of each tale, I want to hold them alongside one another this morning and just reflect. On the one hand, we have a valley of dry bones. On the other, a beloved friend, 4 days buried. 2 experiences of death. One long-suffering, dried up, a dull ache, a sad acceptance. The other, fresh, sharp, still echoing shock and pain, cycling swiftly through denial and grief and bartering. Death shows up in different ways in our lives, doesn't it? Sometimes it's a dull acceptance, other times a sharp pain. Sometimes it's a valley of bones, once a living thing, but so long gone now that the flesh and sinew have dried up and flown away in the wind. Only the scattered bones remain. A barely discernible testimony to what once was, too long ago to remember. The other is so present, so fresh and painful that we find ourselves forgetting to breathe. Minds racing. The impact is too close for comfort, and it upends our lives minute by minute. My father walked out on my family when I was 18 years old. My siblings were 8 and 10. My mom had been a stay-at-home parent. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. He is still alive. My children don't believe this. But he has a new life in New Brunswick with a wife and her children and their grandchildren. This is a valley of dry bones for me. It's been over 20 years. Sure, there's a dull ache when I think about it, but it doesn't interrupt my life daily. Not anymore. You have experienced a life-altering pain at some point. years ago, the death of a parent or a spouse or a sibling, the loss of a job or a home or a relationship, a dream unfulfilled, a version of yourself never actualized, a relationship shattered. It's there. It's part of you and your story, but it's not sharp anymore. The edges have softened over the years. A sad resignation taking up residence in your chest. You catch yourself thinking, it's not the way I saw my life panning out, but it is what it is. I know what it feels like to cast my eyes across a valley of dry bones. And I know that you do too. You've shown them to me. And we've sat together in that dull ache, grateful for a moment's reprieve from the loneliness. The death of Lazarus, now that's a different grief. This grief we know all too well also. Even the Son of God himself wept. Jesus was deeply disturbed, it says in John, which I guess is one way to put it. Jesus was angry. If you know your Greek, you know that the first verb, embrimaomai, suggests anger and indignation. And the primary meaning of the second verb is agitated or troubled, used here to underscore the intensity of Jesus' emotion. It's fresh and sharp for him. This is the acute pain that we might feel with a sudden job loss, a betrayal, a diagnosis, an accident, an attack, and yes, a death. In the unrelenting grasp of this kind of death, we are not rational, functioning people making fully fleshed out decisions. We are in our reptilian brain, our limbic system, our fight or flight responses. We are angry, afraid, panicked, grief-stricken, in shock and numb, sleeping, impossible, eating off the table. We say things we wouldn't normally say, and we do things that we wouldn't normally do. I know what it feels like to stand outside of Lazarus's proverbial tomb. To scream and fight and cry and pray and deny, to be deeply disturbed, to want to cast blame. Lord, if you had been there, this wouldn't have happened. This pain is too fresh for me to talk about from the pulpit, but it's there. And I know it is for you too. Some of you are in the thick of it right now. Every time this season in the church calendar rolls around, I find myself asking it again. And I think the longer I'm in ministry, the more intense this question gets. I wonder if life itself is less like an Easter Sunday parade and more like plodding through the days of Holy Week. Bittersweetness, betrayal, intimacy, pain, humiliation, and the relentless looming shadow of death. Maybe that is what it means to be human. But there's something else besides death that connects these two stories. Something else woven deep within the stories that make up Holy Week. Something else you might catch out of the corner of your eye. There's something else that connects these two stories, and it's hope. The hand of the Lord came upon me, recalls Ezekiel, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord. He set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, "Human one, can these bones live?" What kind of question is that? The audacity that is required to speak about hope in these days. We're facing a climate crisis coming at us like a speeding train on the tracks, never-ending war, a growing immigration crisis, a terrifying surge in hate groups, rising global fascism, genocide, technological overload, and in case we forget, an ongoing pandemic, because it's not over yet. In her commentary for this Sunday's passage, Reverend Danielle Schroyer writes, "If fear were an energy source, we could all power our homes and cars for a year." It's a nice, sustainable, renewable one. What kind of particular insanity is a Christian who stands before all of this and says, God is love, peace is the way, justice will arrive? If God personally came to my door, she writes, and asked me if this world was going to make it, most days I'd probably say no. I'm not even sure our country is going to make it. She's American, so we'll leave it there. How will we not fracture under all of this pressure, all of this collective anxiety wreaking havoc on every institution and every system we have? End quote. The pain of death all around us is both long-lasting and aching and fresh and sharp. Human one, can these bones live? I don't know, Lord, says one of the greatest prophets of all time. I don't know, only you know. Take away the stone. Are you nuts, Jesus? The smell of rot and decay will be too much. Last week we talked about the value of asking good questions, right? Questions that aren't leading, questions that aren't loaded. This week it's the Lord asking a question of us. Can these bones live? God doesn't ask if it's likely or if the forecast looks promising. God doesn't ask for narrative budgets, pie charts, and percentages or forecasts. Notice also that God doesn't say to us, yes, this is quite the pickle. Do you know what you're going to do to get out of it? Because God already knows our answer, like Ezekiel's, would be a firm no. So instead, God simply asks, can these bones live? This is not a question of probability. It's a question of possibility. And possibility is a pathway to hope. Looking out over the valley of dry bones, God asks Ezekiel and asks us today, can you see past this rubbish? The damage, the crisis, the violence, the signs of decay. And can you imagine that life still lingers there? Do you dare to believe and even trust that the power of life does not ever go underground in such a way that God cannot revive it in glory? A similar question hangs in the air when Jesus speaks with Mary and Martha in their fresh, sharp grief. Their brother has been dead and buried for 4 days. They understand enough to know that Jesus brings life, but this question asks more of them. Do you have faith that life is possible always? Or is resurrection only a post-mortem pipe dream? I am the resurrection. Right now, today, Jesus says, in the midst of this life, with all its fragility and disappointment and grief and shame and broken dreams and tears, I am the resurrection right now. Life exists right now. Do you have faith, Jesus asks of them, that life is possible always, even here, as we stand outside of a tomb? Can we trust that life is always possible in God? Or have we relegated it to something that happens after the tomb is sealed shut? Can we find hope and even faith when we are sitting in a valley of dry bones and in front of a tomb filled with literal death? God doesn't ask us to believe the situation will get better. God asks us to believe that life itself will not, in the end, cower under the pressure of human destruction. Abundant life persists. This is what makes it eternal. I was recently in a parking lot behind a restaurant when I caught sight of something absolutely spectacular. For me, anyway, I'm a little odd. A tree had been cut down, clearly, to make space for a chain link fence that needed to go up to separate the lot from the space behind it. Now, I know it's not uncommon for shoots to come up around a stump. Roots are deep. But what caught my attention this time was that the shoots had grown through the fence and grown so large with so many branches that it was its own tree in the clearing. In fact, I'm convinced that when its leaves are out, and I might go back and check this in the summer, you wouldn't even be able to tell that its origins are on the other side of a metal fence. What was once a stump, cut off, dried up, was now a large tree, enough to provide shelter for birds and small creatures, and leaves that bring healing and oxygen. Can these bones live? Can they? God asks us to believe that life itself will not, in the end, cower. Life will not cower under the pressure of human destruction. Do you believe that? And here's likely one of my favorite connections between these two stories and our lives today. That even when we have that trust, that yes, life finds a way, God asks for more. God commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones. Jesus told those gathered to unbind Lazarus and let him go. This ridiculous, radical hope is not only ours to receive and hold, but also to proclaim, to enact, to prophesy. How often have we mistakenly assumed that prophecies are only for condemnation? Prophesy to the bones. Lazarus, come out. Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, mortal. Lazarus, come out. People, unbind him. Can these bones live? I don't know, Lord. Only you know. The dry, parched, dead places in our stories, that old grief that we carry in our bones, can these bones live? Yes. Yes, they can. But they're not the old bodies, the old memories, the old stories reanimated. New sinews, new flesh, new skin. The Ruach, the Spirit, the breath of God, has made something new. Can these bones live? Can you say yes? And at the tomb of fresh death, sharp pain, can these bones live? Would you roll away the stone? Can you believe that life could be here? Even in the throes of life's sharpest pain. Can these bones live? I think sometimes it's fear, maybe cynicism, that really masks us from being able to see and prophesy about life. Can you find glimmers of God's abundance even in this valley of the shadow of death? As I've done in a few other weeks in this series, I'd like to end with the poem written by Reverend Sarah Speed. And I've been reading this one over and over to myself all week. And so hopefully you have a copy of the devotional. You'll find it in there. Maybe if you're comfortable doing so, you can close your eyes and just let these words wash over you. It's the question we ask at the end of our rope, when the storm is raging, when the monsters under the bed have introduced themselves, when everything around us seems to be on fire. It's the question we ask when hope slips through like sand in a bottle, when the mockingbird stops singing, when the news reporter leads with another mass shooting. It's the question we ask when the depression moves in, making herself at home, making a mess of it all. It's a question we ask when we're not sure if Easter will come. Will it be Lent forever? Will the sun ever rise? Will this hope lead to something? Can these bones ever live? Thank God, Easter is coming. To God be all the glory. Amen.